Okay, here we go. So, much smaller screen. Well, kia ora tātou everybody, and welcome. Today we're announcing the next steps in our plan to increase housing supply and improve housing affordability. We've invited National to participate in forming the legislation that we plan to pass because it was clear that the National Party supported moves to speed up housing intensification. We've had constructive discussions over a number of months and have now reached an agreement on the announcement we are making today. So you can see that I'm joined here by Judith Collins and the Housing and Environment spokesperson, and of course our Minister of Housing, David Parker, is beaming into us from Auckland. He's also down the back of the room if you're looking for him. So having broad political consensus on these changes gives homeowners, councils, investors and developers greater certainty. We are pleased to have national support in enabling New Zealanders to have access to modernising our cities in this way. It makes sense to work together where there is a consensus. We need stable, enduring solutions to fix a housing crisis that has been decades in the making. There is no silver bullet, but combined with other measures taken by this government, these changes will start to make a difference. I will invite Judith Collins and Nicola Willis to speak a little later. New Zealand has a serious housing shortage and has simply not built enough homes to meet the needs of New Zealanders. This is making housing increasingly unaffordable, with its effects felt most strongly by New Zealand's poorest, vulnerable and younger generations. You will see the impact of this as many families and whānau struggle to buy their first home or find suitable rental accommodation. New Zealanders need more choices so they can live affordably in a wider variety of housing types that have good access to jobs, transport and community facilities. However, overly restrictive planning rules are getting in the way of and making it difficult to build the right homes that we need in the right places. Last year, we took an action to remove these rules by introducing the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, or the NPSUD as it's become affectionately known. The NPSUD is a powerful tool that enables greater intensification in our cities and requires our councils to plan for better growth. Intensification is important because enabling more homes to be built within our major urban areas is one of the key things that we can do to help with the housing crisis. It is also critical to encouraging low-carbon cities necessary to address climate change and meet our emissions targets. Councils are making good progress implementing the NPSUD, but it will take until 2024 at the earliest for its impact to begin to be felt. The need for further and immediate action is clear, and that's why we will be amending the RMA to bring forward and strengthen the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. Modelling suggests the changes we are making will result in at least 48,200 and as many as 105,500 new homes in our largest cities over the next 5 to 8 years. The PricewaterhouseCoopers cost-benefit analysis notes this is a permanent shift in the flexibility of housing supply with a long-term impact of more compact, efficient and affordable cities. I'll now pass over to Minister Parker to give some of the more details of the changes, and then he will then in turn pass to Ms Collins.
Thank you, Minister Woods. Can I acknowledge the Leader of the Opposition, the Honourable Judith Collins and other colleagues from the House appearing this morning. Can I begin by also welcoming the arrangement that we've made with the National Party. I think it's important that there's a broad political consensus to deliver stable, enduring policy around the urban density that we need as a country. As Minister Woods has already said, there are two key parts to the announcement today. Firstly, We're creating a new planning process so that the Tier 1 councils in Greater Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga, Wellington and Christchurch can implement the changes required by the NPSUD faster. This means that new policies and rules enabling intensification will be in their plans from August 2023, and indeed they'll be notified earlier than that. This brings forward the implementation of density by more than a year. Secondly, we're enabling even more density across all of our major cities by requiring those Tier 1 councils to make medium density the default in most residential areas. This will allow more houses, such as townhouses and units, to be built, but it won't require it. To achieve this, we're introducing a medium density residential standard that will enable landowners to build up to 3 stories on most sites without the need for a resource consent. Exemptions for certain circumstances, such as natural hazards or where a particular site has heritage value, will be maintained. Increasing density of our urban areas will give people more choices about where they can live affordably in a wider variety of housing types. Plan changes implementing the new standards will be notified by councils by August next year, the existing national policy statement on urban development deadline. Some of these standards will have legal effect at this time, which will have an immediate enabling effect on new supply. The new standards will also result in fewer resource consents being required, and where a resource consent is needed, the process will be simpler. It almost goes without saying that councils are, of course, crucial to bringing forward and strengthening the NPS on urban development successfully. And my discussions with a number of mayors in these Tier 1 councils today has me confident that the vast majority of them are welcoming of the assistance that we're giving to bring this forward. We've asked officials from the Ministry for the Environment and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development to continue to work alongside councils to support timely and effective implementation. We're also going to reduce the current workload for councils by reducing some of the existing complexities in the NPSUD, and this makes it simpler for them to implement. Of course, while we're doing this, we're also undertaking the wider reform of the resource management system, which of course speaks to the wider challenges that we're trying to overcome as a country. There's been a wide range of evidence that demonstrating that removing planning rules that are restrictive can result in significant increases in housing supply. I urge those who are interested to read the PwC Sense Partners cost-benefit analysis here. It's very, very thorough, and their midpoint estimate is that there will be 75,000 additional dwellings in our 5 largest urban areas, over and above those expected from the impending NPSUD. The PwC report also notes that the urban development NPS that we've already got is probably having larger effects than were previously estimated. On top of these benefits to rural housing numbers, of course, there are improved equity outcomes for first home buyers and for renters, and there's a slowdown in the transfer of wealth from to existing property owners from renters and first home buyers. We recognise that housing supply issues aren't limited to our bigger cities. Tier 2 councils will be required to adopt the medium density residential standard if an acute housing need is identified in those areas, and other councils can also opt in if they want to use these faster processes. The government's wider RMA reforms will transition these rules into the new system. That bigger reform, of course, takes a little bit more time to implement fully, which is why we're proceeding apace with this at this time. And now I hand over to the Honourable Judith Collins.
Well, thank you very much, Minister Parker. Well, thank you, everyone. It's so good to be here today announcing a bipartisan commitment to cutting red tape and the regulation that makes it so hard to build houses in New Zealand. I have been convinced for a long time now, in fact for many years, that rolling back the council resource consenting rules is the key to addressing many of our housing woes. It is crazy to me that existing planning rules in New Zealand actually make it harder to get houses built. harder and more expensive. In the last term of Parliament, I wrote to the Minister for the Environment offering to work together on RMA reform for this very reason. And during the last election campaign, I announced that a national government would act to introduce emergency housing legislation to cut back resource consenting rules in its first 100 days. And at the start of this year, following my speech, State of the Nation speech, I wrote to the Prime Minister offering to work together on emergency legislation to cut the red tape tying up our housing market. And in April, I took the step of introducing my own Members' Bill and writing to all party leaders asking for their support. Our housing emergency is an absolute crisis. And at the sharp end, we have seen State House waiting lists quadruple in just the last 4 years. But housing is an issue that touches all Kiwis. We see young families locked into renting, kids growing up without any particular roots in a community. We see young families forced to save for a decade to build a deposit and putting off decisions because of that lack of certainty. And our expensive housing means less money is spent making homes warm and dry. And the nearly $200,000 increase in house prices in just the last year actually increases inequality and it divides communities even more. All of these things mean New Zealand communities are not what they would be in a world where we cut back on housing regulation, where people had the right to build. And National supports this policy because it focuses on supply. Rather than making life harder for property owners, this policy tells them that you have the right to build. That's why we support it. To those that worry reduced regulation may mean a neighbour subdivides or that a community loses its character, I say this: our communities lose their character when people can't afford to own their own home. Stronger communities are formed when families can own their home. And it is in the interests of all Kiwis to live in a property-owning community, where people put down anchors in their community and have a stake in local affairs, where kids get to stay at the same school, where the politics of envy aren't fuelled by rapidly rising house prices, where our children can afford to buy a home and start a family, and growing up in a property-owning democracy. The bill we are announcing today focuses on cutting the red tape that stops people building homes. If we live in one of our 5 biggest cities, and under this bill, you can subdivide your property, build an extension, or a deck, or a sleep out, without needing a resource consent. Almost anything within 3 stories without a resource consent. It is about fixing our housing woes by simply giving Kiwis the right to build their home. The bill doesn't risk quality because building code of compliance will still be needed. But we scale back the resource consent that allows a town planner to tell you how your house should look. Announcing this bill together with the government is a vital step to send the signal to councils that New Zealand's 2 major political parties are committed to working together to roll back the planning red tape. And I want to thank Ministers Woods and Parker for accepting the invitation to work together and for reaching out with their own proposal on how to scale back consenting requirements. I especially want to thank Nicola Willis and the Honourable Scott Simpson for their work. Well done. There is so much more to do to see Kiwis all across New Zealand be truly given the right to build. But today we take the first step by sending a bipartisan signal that both major political parties are working together. Thank you.
Thank you. So just some of the detail, which I'm sure... Oh, sorry, Nicola. Yeah.
That's all right. Today is a good day. New Zealand's 2 major political parties are joining forces to announce much needed and long awaited changes that will make it easier to build new housing in this country. Labour and National are standing together to say an emphatic yes to housing in our backyards. As Judith says, National, along with the Reserve Bank, the Productivity Commission and many economists have consistently argued that land use restrictions and arcane planning rules have helped drive ever higher house prices in New Zealand. The RMA amendments we are proposing today offer urgently needed relief. They will allow for more density in existing residential areas, upzoning, as well as allowing local authorities to fast-track plan changes that enable new greenfields development. These changes will ensure our major cities can develop, can grow up and out, providing housing where people want to live, with a range of housing types to suit them at different stages of life. Historically, cross-party support for changes of this sort has been hard to find. Today's coming together is a proportionate response to the scale of the housing emergency New Zealand faces. Our country has some of the most unaffordable housing in the world, and Kiwis expect MPs to take action to address it. Homeowners and non-homeowners alike all know that the property ladder has simply been pulled out of reach of too many people. Our housing shortage is fueling inequality and robbing younger New Zealanders of hope. Today's announcements will help put new rungs on the property owning ladder. To those who say they prefer a one-storey house with a big garden, then know that you can welcome this bill, safe in the knowledge that no one will make you demolish your existing home, and many like yours will continue to be built. And to those who are desperately looking for a townhouse, granny flat or apartment close to your work, or as a lower maintenance place to retire to, then know that this bill will unlock far more choices for your future. This bill is a win-win, delivering more choices for the first home buyers of tomorrow while enhancing the right to build for the homeowners of today. These measures are not about a one-time increase in housing stock, but a permanent shift in the flexibility of the supply of housing. And over time, it will deliver more affordable housing. The difference may be small at first, it will be noticeable within a decade and enormous for the next generation. I want to say thank you to Ministers Woods and Parker for engaging National to help develop these proposals. And I hope that New Zealanders see today's announcement as evidence of the constructive approach National is taking to help solve our housing emergency. Don't get me wrong, this bill will not solve all New Zealand's housing problems. There is much more work to do. National will keep promoting new housing ideas and constructively criticising the government's failures. And I intend to keep giving that a go in future question times, Minister. But today is not the day for that. Today, Labour and National welcome a step forward for housing in New Zealand. It's a special moment and one National is pleased to have helped make possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicola. Just a bit of detail before we head into questions. So the legislation will be introduced into the House today. It will have its first reading next Tuesday, the 26th of October, and it will be referred to the Environment Select Committee. There will be a 3-week submission period, followed by oral hearings and a report on any recommended changes by the 6th of December. The bill will be passed in the last week of Parliament for this year by the 16th of December. And we're happy to take any questions, with the obvious caveat that we need to clear this room for another event in the not too distant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is this the death of NIMBYism?
Well, I think we certainly hope so. That what we are seeing today is that we're seeing two major political parties come together to say that actually we need to provide leadership. We need to provide leadership in our cities and work with our councils around the country to say we need to enable far more choice in our cities. At the moment, we have planning rules in place in some parts of our cities that actually don't allow people to build at the density which will deliver affordability for so many people.
Councils have obviously tried to tackle this problem many times with their own sort of unitary plans on this, and it's been a real fight in certain suburbs to get this through. How do you imagine this policy, or bill rather, will go down in those suburbs which have said, no, not in my backyard?
So, I mean, I'll just have a go and then pass over to Nicola or to Ms Collins. I think that what we've seen is this has been an incredibly fraught and difficult issue for so many councils in different parts of the country. I think that New Zealanders can see that that what they're saying is central government step up and take some leadership on this issue and coming together to say that actually when there is a housing crisis that you need to lay aside some of your differences, and I'm sure the differences will get an airing on another day, but that we do need to step up, take that leadership, and that we do need to help our councils be able to work through these issues with local communities. I think the point that Nicola made in her speech, that this is not requiring anyone to pull down their single dwelling on a section. What it is doing is enabling more choice in our neighbourhoods, that we can see greater density in more of our suburbs across New Zealand.
Perhaps Michael, just to add to that, in the National Party we believe very fully in people having private property rights, and we also know that for people to have a large section, that's great. If they want to use it, if it's their choice. But for some people, that large section is just something that they end up having to mow. And in their 70s and 80s, it becomes actually a terrible drain on them. So to give them the choice to decide that they can, for instance, build themselves a new property, new home, and that they can sell their larger home next door, that gives people choice, and choice is absolutely crucial in a property owning democracy.
Thank you. Sorry, we'll just come over here and just spread this around a bit. Thank you.
My question is actually for Mr Parker, in his capacity both as Minister for the Environment and Minister for Revenue. Inevitably, this will raise the value of land in the parts of the cities that are affected by it. Is there any proposal to impose value capture taxes on people gaining those windfall gains?
No, there's not. The Pricewaterhouse Sense Partners analysis goes into the issues as to what will be the effect on land prices. And overall, the cost of housing-related land per housing unit decreases quite markedly. Over time, in all suburbs, the greatest incentive to intensification will occur in the areas that are closest to the metropolitan centres, but the benefits will be felt throughout the housing market.
The property owners are going to get substantial gains.
Not overall, no. The effect of the constraint on supply, economists agree, is that overall house prices and land prices are higher than they should be because of the artificial constraints on land supply. And I think both the main political parties agree with that economic analysis. And the PricewaterhouseCoopers, or the PwC report, analyses very carefully what's already happened in Auckland in their mixed use zone, which is similar to this medium density that we're proposing. And they note that since 2017, the total number of houses built in Auckland has doubled from 10,000 to 20,000, but 70% of that increase, more than 7,000 of that increase of 10,000, is actually coming from these medium density opportunities. And of course, that's occurring because they're easier to build, these 3-storied walk-ups, and they're more affordable for people to buy, and they're a more efficient use of infrastructure for the councils as well.
Yeah, how do you ensure that this is done well and that there's a corresponding, boost in, public transport and other infrastructure that comes along with the boost in the density of housing?
So this is, of course, tying into the MPSUD, so that where the greatest requirements for density is around what we see as really suburban commercial centres or city centres, so that it is very much tying in and making sure that we are maximising the value that we're getting out of infrastructure investment, particularly transport investment, that we can have greater density of people living there. It's the fact that we already had framework, that it had had a lot of work done on it in terms of how it is that we do good urban planning, that we're able to bring forward. Thank you. Just here and then over to Bernard.
Do you think, or does the analysis suggest that this will actually lower prices, not necessarily for housing, but for apartments and other medium density housing, like townhouses?
Look, what we know is the way to drive affordability is often through typology, and that's through density. And it is having duplexes and multi-unit dwellings that can drive those affordability outcomes. It also allows us to maximise the benefit that we see out of infrastructure investment. And as David went into that in his answer, which I won't go over, there's quite a lot of material in the cost-benefit analysis from PricewaterhouseCoopers and Sense Partners. I think we're making that available to media to have a look at. We're just going to go over to Bernard and we'll come back.
Existing apartment owners, will basically their house prices, their property value go down?
Oh, look, I think what we know is that we have a huge amount of need and capacity for supply in our housing market before we get anywhere close to that.
A question for the Minister and for the opposition leader. Firstly, do you expect this to deliver a supply shock that you would like to see drive house prices lower? Firstly, to the Minister.
So the estimate of the number that this will enable, this is the medium density will enable over and above what the MPSUD would be according to the cost benefit analysis, is between 48,500 and 1,500. Midpoint of around the 75,000 is actually called a conservative number in the cost benefit analysis. So I think that we will see the capacity for more supply. We know that we do have a housing shortage, and that is one of the things that is driving the crisis that we're seeing in New Zealand housing. We don't see this as simply a supply and demand problem. We know that there's some other underlying factors, and that's where this fits into our program around housing in terms of infrastructure investment. What we want to do is we certainly want to see the enabling of more affordable houses being built, and what this will do will allow it, that we have planning rules in some parts of our cities that actively stop a typology that is affordable for people to purchase. I think we just come over here now. We'll do. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Okay. So obviously this deals with land and people getting consents to build. What it doesn't do is it doesn't actually get the houses built. So there are other things involved in it, and those are things that are for another day, which is around building supplies, training, trades, all those sorts of things, all of which are important to getting a house built. In terms of value, I think what we'll find is that there will be some people who will feel that their lawn is now something of value. And that goes to Richard Harmon's point that some people will find that they can sell that lawn. But in terms of house prices, do I think that that's going to suddenly bring about a drop? No, I don't see this as a supply shock. What I do believe is a shot in the arm to make sure that the country doesn't continue down a path whereby housing is something that other people own and our kids get to rent.
Thank you, Sam. Oh, sorry, David, go. Yep.
Yeah, Bernard, if you look at table 3 of the cost benefit analysis, there's an assessment there of what house price inflation would have been but for this announcement. So we're not expecting house prices to drop, but we think that house price inflation will abate according to the analysis that is in that report.
Yeah.
Related to Benedict's question about infrastructure and your response about the MPSUD, you're bringing that forward by this year, but councils have talked about not necessarily having the planning support at a central level that they need and the resources. So, there's a bit of a stick there to speed things up. But what carrot is there? What is the government doing, or for national, what should they be doing to give councils the help they actually need to sort of make this a reality?
So I'll just talk about what's in this ledge in terms of what we're doing, in terms of listening to some of the concerns that have come through from our Tier 1 councils in particular, is that we're removing the demand assessment and better defining what it means in terms of accessibility. So this is around the density that is required around those suburban commercial hubs or town centres that I was talking about, so that we are giving councils more flexibility to upzone in areas that they consider the most appropriate for the 6-storey requirement under the NPSUD, and giving more definition around what means there. I think removing that demand assessment is something that will remove a lot of the onus for councils around this. In terms of what other incentives there are for councils in terms of carrot, well, of course, for us, for the government, it's certainly around the investment we're making in infrastructure, that we see this as part of this package, but National will have something to say on that as well.
Thank you, Minister. I think one of the points, Sam, is that the councils won't need to have such a heavy, planning process when it comes to properties like this that we're talking about. So they will be able to save some resource use there. But obviously, councils we need to have a better way of dealing with and helping some of the infrastructure requirements that councils have. We've put out plans around that before. The government will have its own plans, and no doubt we'll discuss those over the next little while. But also remembering that as new properties are built, or houses are built, or homes, that councils will have more rates as well to help pay for costs, and they'll be able to benefit from that as well. I think too, when we had a question before about public transport, one of the best ways of getting public transport efficient and effective, timely and reliable, is to have better density when it comes to housing.
And can I just say that this enables councils to do what many of them already want to do. I've heard councillors say, I want to speed up zoning for more housing in our city, but I am constrained by the Resource Management Act. Right. Today we're taking away some of those constraints.
Giving choice.
Have councils come to you with concerns? Obviously all of these NPS changes can be litigated and will be litigated as they're incorporated into council plans. Have councils made any of those concerns to you, and if so, are you planning to help them out with the cost of fighting to implement this through the courts?
Look, I think the biggest concern was actually around the demand assessment in terms of the definition around accessibility, that I think that what we're seeing with the changes that we're announcing today, that will remove a large amount of that. We're defining more tightly exactly what is the requirement around there. So I think that is taking the onus off councils to a large extent and addresses that concern.
Right. Most councils, I think, in the country will be expecting to get sued lots over the next couple of years. Are you going to do anything to help them address the cost and concerns around that?
Well, I think one of the things that they can take comfort in is that we are making the legislative amendments, so that does give them protection. Yeah. Sorry, I'll just go here to some here.
What consideration has been made about the impact on pressure on construction supply chains the world over in this sort of post-pandemic world?
Look, an obvious concern, but whether or not we make this change or we build our houses in another way, the fact is New Zealand has a shortage of houses, and that we have to build them if we're going to solve the housing crisis. That I think what we're seeing with the announcement today and the focus on density actually gives us far more opportunity to use innovative technology such as off-site manufacturing. We've seen in those medium density zones in Auckland good uptake, particularly actually by Kaingaora itself, of off-site manufacturing and faster ways of building. So we need to keep pushing on that with more demand around this form of housing that actually allows more of an industry to develop in New Zealand as well for more and more off-site manufacturing. So we need to do that, but we can't just rely on that. We have to keep our push up around training. We need to encourage more young people into the building and construction sectors, and that is what we will continue to do and have been doing over the 4 years that we have been in government. The supply chains, of course, that is an ongoing issue, and it isn't it isn't contained to New Zealand, and it's one that we're actively working through the Construction Sector Accord with our build partners there to find ways that we can take a New Zealand Inc. approach to how it is that we ensure that we have the supplies that we need to solve our housing crisis.
And I think for those who are wondering how it all works, this is very similar to what we did in government after Christchurch earthquakes, where we enabled housing to get built. This will also give confidence to builders. It will give confidence to those who can bring in building materials, and it will give confidence to people, younger people and others who might want to enter a building trade, that there will be work for them.
Thank you.
One to you and one to Judith Thomas, if that's okay. Why aren't the Green Party here? They're literally a part of the government, and they've issued a statement broadly welcoming these changes. Are they not part of the bipartisan push?
In January, the Prime Minister received a letter from Ms Collins offering to work together. The Prime Minister asked Minister Parker, as Minister for the Environment, and myself, as Minister of Housing, to engage with the National Party in response to that letter. This is work that we have been working through for over a period of time now, and really want to acknowledge the constructive way that we've been able to work with Nicola and Scott as we've worked through. The proposal that we're announcing today is not the proposal either of us started with. I think it's fair to say that we were able to work through this. So there was a direct ask of us, and we responded with a direct reply.
Involved in all of this?
No, this is work that has been worked through between Labour and National. Of course, I deal almost on a daily basis with the Green Party on other housing issues. Marama Davidson is an Associate Minister of Housing and someone that I have a huge amount of contact with. But on this piece of work, this is work that we work through with the National Party.
Sorry, can I just ask my second question to Judith Collins?
Mm-hmm.
This is obviously very refreshing. I think people will find it, helpful in this particular policy space. Without any political pot shots, do you actually feel like there are other areas where you can achieve results with this government working hand in hand closely together?
Well, I'm sure that there are, and we can see COVID as one of them. But I think too that it is very important in something like RMA reform housing, that it takes a long time to get a house built. It takes a long time to bring about changes, and we've both, as major political parties who normally we lead governments, we need to be able to take a bipartisan approach, and developers and homeowners and people who want to be homeowners, they need us to show cross-party and also cross-term support for changes, so that we don't change the rules on them partway through a development.
Yeah, further to Ben's question, so is, climate change, obviously massive crisis. Is this something that you could see in the future, working bipartisan on an issue like
Well, we often do on certainly parts of it, but we have a different approach on some of that. I think it's also important to understand that the role of the opposition is not only to propose, but also to oppose when we believe that's the right thing for the country.
Just further on that, that I think that we have already seen that on climate change, that we had broad support for the legislation that went through last term that introduced our Climate Commission. Again, that's another long-run issue, decades in the making, and is going to be decades in the solving.
Sorry, just further, I just one more question for the opposition. Is this, you worried this has muddled you on housing?
Oh, I don't think so. It certainly is something that we take very seriously, and I would like to see anyone try and muzzle Nicola.
Yeah.
You wouldn't like to see it, surely.
Thank you,
Can you just talk a little bit about how useful this political cover is for you? Because obviously this is a controversial change for a lot of people who own houses in these neighbourhoods. They might not really like the idea of someone next door building a three-storey, medium density block. Were you worried that if you did force something like that through, then there's a lot of resentment for National to pick up on, and I guess for the opposition as well? Obviously, that you were in government not so long ago. Labour could have picked up on that opposition and gone pretty hard on it. How useful is it to have flattening the issue between the major two parties?
I don't think it's so much about flattening the issue. I think it's actually about sending a very strong message to people who are making quite long-term investment decisions, in many cases that are going to stretch over 10, 20, 30 years without, the most optimism in the world. I think everyone knows that covers more than a single term in government. So that it is actually about giving that long-term signal and long-term certainty to people so that we can start to see the planning and the investment that we need to come on stream to get the houses that we need to solve our housing crisis. I think I can't speak for National, but certainly the conversations that we've had during this process of working together has been very focused on that long-term and enduring change, and that New Zealand is seeing that we can come together and work constructively to address one of these pressing issues that undermines the kind of investment that we need.
Yeah. Useful for you that Labor can't call you.
Well, I imagine. I imagine that it is much easier in government, having been in government, just how much easier it is to be able to work constructively with the opposition. And this is not just about us. I mean, one day we will not be politicians, but we are still Kiwis who worry about the fact that we have a country where an entire generation is growing up thinking they can't buy a home. And actually, that's not good enough. We need to do better, and that's why we're happy to be part of this particular proposal.
Sorry, Minister Woods, just another one. On infrastructure for councils, you've obviously got this fund. Lots of councils say that isn't enough. We've already seen places like Taranaki Street in Wellington already upzoned, but they're building townhouses there, not an apartment block, because the stormwater system's not good enough and the council doesn't have the money to pay for it. Are you looking to do more in that space to give councils enough capital to be able to fund things like free waters, to be able to upzone, to actually make use of these upzoning changes?
So, I mean, when we talk about infrastructure for housing, that's just a fancy word for roads and pipes. So I think you can look across a range of measures. There's the Housing Acceleration Fund, which is the largest boost of central government funding to local councils that we've seen in decades. And we're still in the process of distributing that money, and I think that's a really important process that we're going through. We've obviously had the expressions of interest that have already come in, that's closed, working through those, but there's also the transport funding that goes into it, and you rightly identify Three Waters funding as well that will come to bear on this. We need to, one of the jobs that we know that we have as a government and as a team of ministers that are responsible for a large part of this infrastructure is make sure that we're working together in complementary ways so that we're seeing how we see our transport and our infrastructure investments impacting on housing. So there's a lot of money, more money than there ever has been in terms of assisting councils with this, and we'll continue to work through this. But when we announced that Housing Acceleration Fund, despite it being $3.8 billion worth of funding, we acknowledged at the time that that does not solve everything, but it is a start. We've got time for one more question before we need to be out here.
Minister, are you looking at changing the debt restraints for councils, which they say stop them from building the infrastructure for this densification? Because one of the problems in the past is that developers say they want to build these houses, but then the council says, here's a monstrous development contribution charge because we can't afford to borrow the money, the government won't let us. So what are you going to do about these debt limits for councils?
So that isn't on the agenda at the moment, Bernard. Of course, what we have done is actually say that the money that we're working with councils on is not in the form of a loan, and often for the very reason that you outline. That in terms of just adding more to the debt side of councils isn't the way to achieve this, because it doesn't allow the kind of investment that we need. That's why it's direct grant payments. So we're working through those expressions of interest, and we'll have more announcements to make about direct funding, which isn't about enabling councils to borrow more. Just half a question. Sorry, David, you go.
Yeah, could I just add to that? Again, the cost-benefit analysis goes through this issue very, very carefully. And it shows that overall infrastructure costs are lower when you do this, including transport and water infrastructure overall, than if you don't. So if you apply that lens to it, this is actually helping councils save costs rather than creating more costs. The underlying pressure for housing is neither caused by central government or local government, but we've both got to accommodate it. This is a more cost-effective way of doing so.
Thank you. Just one very last question from Janae. That is seriously the last one.
Yeah. In terms of the infrastructure, I mean, councils are saying that that fund is not enough, and there are more applications than there are money available. And there are those debt limits. I mean, this seems like another piece of the puzzle that could be solved quite easily to just put some more money on the table for infrastructure. I don't want to sound like, you know, there's lots of money around, but why not sort of finish the whole package?
Well, I think, Janae, one of the most important things we have to do is work through the expression of interests we have now, to have a look what is actually ready to go, what is going to be ready to go in these tier 1 areas, and match that to housing need. So we've always said that we fully understood that $3.8 billion was not going to fully solve the problems for New Zealand, but what we certainly want to be able to do is to work through this in a robust and rigorous way. Thank you very much, everybody.
Masks, masks.